I hope to rectify that problem. I was let go, as the polite term means, sacking, by the editor of the Sunday Independent, for whom I was writing articles mainly in support of Brexit. And it wasn't the fashion of the paper at that time to publish such articles, and I was dropped from the staff. It showed something in journalism which I hadn't met so strongly before, which is a failure to have complete balance by the editorial direction of a newspaper and to allow eccentric views to be put forward if that is what the journalists they employ wish to do. Instead of that, the paper adopted a particular line, not a line that I approved of, and that led to my departure from the staff. So it brought to an end 50 years as a journalist in this country. Some of the highlights of which I'd just like to advert to briefly. There will come a time later in today's discussions when I hope Declan Gandy will be here and we'll be able to talk about his impact on journalism and on politics in Ireland and on changing the minds of people in Ireland, which he was very effective at doing. And I'm glad he is on his way here and that we will discuss that. One of the most troubling and difficult jobs I undertook began as journalism and ended in the writing of a book about the industrial school situation in Ireland. 62 schools spread across every county in the country, filled with children who were starved, beaten, ill-treated, not educated, their teeth not attended to, and they suffered from the impact of that method of looking after them, which lasted the whole of their lives. I knew them, some of them, during the time when they were elderly men, and certainly some of them died when I was still writing about the Irish Gulag. And their testimony to me was deeply and lastingly poignant. I would like to write again about that subject because I still think it lingers over the country in a shameful way. Earlier than that, I had a happier time in journalism. I was a friend of Charles Hockey at the beginning of his political career. I wrote speeches for him. He lived in a house that my wife's uncle's family had owned for 100 years, and I went there to tell them a little bit about their life at Abbeyville, and only when he ran into trouble politically and in connection with an arms crisis that he was behind, did we part company as friends, and I turned my attention to examining him as a politician and writing confrontational articles which made him very angry, made him tap my telephone as well as that of Geraldine Kennedy, and gave me a notoriety that I'm not sure I'm very happy to live with for the rest of my life. But nevertheless, that was part of my upbringing as a journalist and part of the determination that I felt journalists had to have, which is to tell the total truth and to tell it irrespective of the views of the paper that he is writing for. I want to give you one up-to-date example and end with that. I read, of course, with great concern about the defeat of Theresa May in respect of her cabinet when she had completed her document for leaving the EU. One of the articles was made up of views that she had expressed early during the campaign about what she was trying to achieve. And the article then ran with what she had achieved in the document. And it made painful reading, because what was left out of it was the role played by the EU. All the things that were raised as comments about her speeches were delivered in derision of her earlier expectation and in the fulfillment of a list of demands made by the EU, which Britain, of course, cannot accept. I don't think that the document that she presented this week is other than some kind of ploy to bring honesty and correct interpretation into the battle of wills that's going on in the House of Commons at this time. But nobody wrote about it. I sat and read the piece and thought to myself, the blame for this situation rests with the EU. They repeatedly loaded her shoulders with things she could not deliver, and they were at odds with things she had espoused as objectives for herself as leader of the government. So we are left with that vacuum where the EU went silent, and when nobody noticed that they had gone silent and said, but the EU are responsible for what has happened to her. It's not herself, it's not her mistakes, it's the EU that have formed around her proposals incredibly difficult points to address and put right. I'm waiting for the outrun from that situation, and I remain, as I have been since Cameron led us into the referendum, fully in support of Britain leaving. I hope they will achieve it one way or the other, and it gives strength and heart to the people I'm addressing here today, whose interest in detachment from the EU is more than just an interest. It has an emotional tug to it, which I fully endorse.
Okay, we're moving swiftly on to our next speaker of the evening. So, our next speaker has been involved, and some of you will know him mostly for this, while others of you will know he's quite a long biography as well. So, but the landmark High Court cases, namely Crotty, McKenna and Pringle, which changed the course of how elections are run and how media must and how the government must publicise and inform the public. He's also a seasoned academic, secretary of the National Platform for EU Research and Information Centre, retired senior lecturer in social policy at Trinity College Dublin, frequent guest in the past on RTE's Questions and Answers. Some of you will definitely know him from that. He has also opposed EU enlargement, the EU treaties, the Single European Act, the Maastricht Treaty, Amsterdam Treaty, the Nice Treaty and the Nice Rerun and the Lisbon Treaty. Made submissions to the Oireachtas Committee on Europe on behalf of the National Platform. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Anthony Coughlin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and good friends. I'm very honoured to have the chance of talking here today at this significant meeting. I think Irexit, Freedom to Prosper, is a very important new initiative. It's early days, but it's certainly meeting a lack, and I think it will go far over the periods ahead and the years to come. I've been at this EU critical business for many a long year. I've always been opposed to the development of a supranational thing in Europe on democratic and internationalist grounds. Democracy, in my opinion, can only exist at the level of the national community, where there's a demos, a people who are willing to accept majority rule because it's their community, their people. The Irish people want to be ruled by the Irish government that they elect. But at the EU level, of course, that is not the case. You have a supranational rule, and nowadays, in fact, the vast majority of our economic laws and many of our social laws come from Brussels. something like 100,000 legal acts that are binding in Ireland. Many of these are standards of one kind or another that we have to obey as European standard, and if the Irish state doesn't obey them, it's subject in principle to fines, and often heavy fines. This is far from the unfettered control of Irish destinies, which the people who signed the 1916 proclamation way back 100 years or more ago did in order to establish an independent Irish state. So all over Europe, of course, people are reacting against this supranationalism, and they want to get their democracy back, their national independence back, and new movements being formed, of which in Ireland this is one. I thought that I might just try and devote myself to two factual points. I can talk about virtually any aspect of the EU. I've been concerned with it for many a long year. I got a job in Trinity College way back in 1961. My first political act as a young junior lecturer was to organise a collective letter to the Irish Times. 1961 was the year that Britain applied to join the EEC, and Ireland and Denmark did so simultaneously with it. The United Kingdom, the UK, Britain and the North applied to join, and we did the same. And I organised a collective letter, signed among others by the late Noel Brown, the late Michael Mullen, the well-known trade unionist, and by Mr. Barry Desmond, former Minister of Health, and who was later head of the European Court of Auditors. They all signed that letter way back in '61. This state only joined, of course, in '73 because de Gaulle kept Britain and with Ireland and Denmark out twice during the '60s. And then I got involved in this court case that the chairman mentioned. I'd just like to deal with two factual issues, which I think a lot of people may not know. You can talk about say an awful lot of things about the EU. First of all, it's myth of origin. Every state or aspiring state has some, what I call a myth of origin, a story, sometimes true, sometimes false, or a mixture of both, as to how it came into being. And the myth of origin of the European Union is that it was a great peace project to bring about, to prevent Europe's wars, and particularly to prevent wars in France and Germany. And it was holding Europe's peace. It's essentially a peace project. It's a key element of propaganda for the EU. And many people who don't really know how the EU works, which is fairly complex in some ways, fall back on that. Oh, it's a peace project. In fact, I'll just give you a few basic points. The origins of the EU were in war preparations. Way back in 1949, after the war, you had, of course, the world divided into two superpowers, the United States of America and the USSR. And the Cold War was beginning, and NATO was founded in 1949, and the Americans particularly wanted Germany to be rearmed as part of NATO for 49. And the French were very upset at the idea of Germany being rearmed only 4 or 5 years after the Germans had occupied France. That was late 40s. So Jean Monnet produced this plan which would overcome French reluctance to rearm in the context of NATO and the Cold War, namely the coal and steel community, whereby the French and the Germans and the Benelux, Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg would pool their coal and steel industries and put them under a supranational high authority that would make laws for them. And then Monnet became the secretary of the supranational high authority, which later merged with the European Commission. So that was the first step towards supranationalism, where a supranational body was set up, the high authority of the coal and steel community, under the 1951 Treaty of Paris. And that was the first supranational element, and it was to overcome French reluctance to accept German rearmament. That was pushed by the United States of America. And then you followed on the common market in 1957 and so on and so forth. But so that's an important point to bear in mind, that the origins really of the EU is not so much a peaceful preparation, but preparation for a war, for the Cold War, to rearm Germany, etc. And the second big development in EU history, 40 years after that, was the establishment of the euro currency, which occurred, of course, in the treaty. It was the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, which gave us the euro currency. The actual currency didn't come into being until the end of the 90s, 1999. But the actual treaty which provided for its coming into being was the Treaty of Maastricht, 1992, just a year or two after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. And the French were very upset at the reunification of Germany, which occurred as a result of the collapse in Eastern Europe. Germany is united as one state. De Gaulle once said, "I like the Germans so much, I prefer 2 of them." So when Germany was united, the French were more happy than when it was reunited. And Mitterrand went off to try and see if Gorbachev could do anything to stop it, and Mrs. Thatcher wasn't too happy either, British Prime Minister at the time. But nothing would stop the reunification of Germany. And the Germans, of course, knew that the French were upset at this, because suddenly they had a new German state, a unified German state. Two states became one. The old East Germany was amalgamated with West Germany. And there were suddenly 20 million more citizens in the German Federal Republic. And it was in that context that the idea of the euro was launched as a way of overcoming French reluctance or French unhappiness at the reunification of Germany. And the deal done was that the Germans would give up the Deutschmark, which is the great symbol of their post-war economic achievement, and pool the running of this new currency with the French and others. And the French in turn would work towards a common foreign policy and a common security and military policy with the Germans. Military union, political union for monetary union for political union, as it was put at the time, or put crudely, the Deutschmark for the euro bond. Because of course, there is not yet a European army, and there's not yet but they're now talking about it quite openly. Because the Germans, of course, economically are much stronger than the French. There are more of them, there's 20 million more. They have the largest block of votes in the EU Council of Ministers. But they don't have a nuclear weapon, and they're precluded by the post-war treaties from having nuclear weapons. The French, of course, have a nuclear weapon. So I think this new talk about the European army, which Macron said he wanted it the other week, and Mrs. Merkel echoed it 3 or 4 days ago. Macron said we want the European army to defend ourselves against the Russians and the Americans. Astonishing statement, because the Americans came to French and British help during World War I and II. So Macron said we want a European army, and he actually said to defend ourselves against the Russians, the Chinese and the Americans. I haven't seen any sign that they're going to attack the French, but they want the European army, and of course there's the military-industrial complex and other powerful interests like arms orders and so on. But that's the French have the nuclear weapon, and so that down the road I wouldn't be surprised towards much closer military cooperation and probably the start of the European army, which would entail, of course, a European nuclear weapon. And so that's a very important development, because of course the Franco-German couple run the European show, more or less. And if they want, they can really push through. And they push through the euro in that context, and they don't want to push through this militarization of the European Union. And they can prevent things that they don't want from happening. And that's actually spelled out in the voting system. The Treaty of Lisbon revised the voting system in the EU for making European laws. Its basic combination voting system now is the Germans having 16% of the vote out of the total, and the French, British and Italians having 12% each, and we have less than 1% of the vote when they have votes. But votes are not very common in the European Council of Ministers in making EU laws, but there's a continual process of every looking around to see who's backing a particular project, what do I call shadow voting, and if there's enough people to push through a particular law, it goes through. Things are rarely put to a vote because smaller states aren't going to cause trouble or insist on votes if they're going to lose them. So it's a myth that the EU is essentially a peace project. Has it prevented wars in Europe? Well, the most important wars in Europe in the last 30 years have been the war in Yugoslavia. The breakup of Yugoslavia entailed a vicious civil war between the Serbs on one hand and the Croats on the other. And of course you had the overthrow of the government in Ukraine in 2014 and the breakaway of the eastern province of Ukraine, where they all talk Russian, or mostly talk Russian. Both of these developments were strongly encouraged by the EU, particularly by Germany. Germany played a big role in the breakup of Yugoslavia. And the French and British were not too happy about it, but they went along in order to preserve the facade of EU unity way back in 1991. Mr. Hermann Genscher, who was German foreign minister at the time, wrote his memoirs and said the breakup of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia is a great victory for German foreign policy. We have liquidated the heritage of World War I, because of course Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia were two states that were set up at the Versailles in 1919 as a result of World War I, but they've been broken up in the last 10 or 12 years. And Germany played a key role in doing that. They're better able to take over small little countries economically than big ones. I won't go into that in detail, but the idea that that the EU is a peace project is really naive, utterly naive. If you look at its historical origins, or some of the more recent developments in relation to Yugoslavia and even Kosovo and the Ukraine. So that's one bit of information. Perhaps some may not agree with these judgments, but I think one can sustain them. The second point I'd like to put before you is this question of EU citizenship. The Treaty of Lisbon, and you remember, we voted against it in 2008 by a majority of voters. Turned out the majority of the electorate, actually 54% of them, of the voters turned out. It's quite high for an Irish referendum. And they voted no to the Treaty of Lisbon in 2008, and then of course our hell broke loose, and the establishment in Ireland and the other states pushed it through a second time without a single change of a jot or tittle in the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty, as you may recall, and some of you will remember that incident, was the EU constitution, because the people who have been pushing the EU project all along want to establish an EU federation. I mentioned earlier on the coal and steel community set up in 1951 in order to pool the coal and steel industries, France, Germany and Benelux, to reconcile France to German rearmament. That was done, the Schuman Declaration, which proposed this, was issued on May the 9th, 1950. And that is Europe Day to this day. The EU every year commemorates, has a special celebration on Europe Day to commemorate the launch of the Schuman Declaration, which was this big first step towards supranationalism.